Welcome back to the Pauper Metagame, where we're still deep diving through decks. We're getting through most of the major decks, so soon we'll be able to spend more time on talking about recent Pauper challenges and looking at new random brews that come out and other just more meta macro level stuff, as well as more micro level specific deck interactions and all kinds of random stuff. But for now, we're continuing on our series where we're just breaking down important decks in the format. Today we're going to talk about Tireless Tribe, aka Tribe Combo, or White Blue Combo, aka Inside Out Combo, whatever you want to call it. It's a combo deck. It's white blue. It's mostly blue, but the key card, one of the key cards, is Tireless Tribe. So Tireless Tribe will cost you one white mana. It's a 1/1 that says discard a card from your hand. Tireless Tribe gets +0/+4 until end of turn. And then the combo simply works with Inside Out, which you can pay a blue or a red, but you're going to pay a blue and a colorless. So it's 2 mana. It says switch target creature's power and toughness until end of turn and draw a card. So you point your Inside Out at your Tireless Tribe, and that's basically it. You chunk your hand and you dome your opponent for 20 damage. So if you can pitch 5 cards, you can do 21 damage. Um, there's a lot of nuances to this deck, so we'll get into some of that. But you could go on so long talking about all the little nuances of this deck. There really is a lot of play to it, and it can look a little wonky when you have a creature combo deck, which might feel susceptible to removal. But the deck has been very successful. It's actually a pretty good, pretty tight composed deck at this point, and it actually works fairly well. So anyway, let's break these down on a card by card level, and then we'll talk about some overlapping card interactions. After Tireless Tribe, the only other creature in the deck is Augur of Bolas. There have been certain times where this slot has been occupied by Delver of Secrets, but it seems like the Augur of Bolas versions seem to be better. The winning lists seem to be going more towards Augur of Bolas and less towards Delver, as the all-in pushing for the combo deck seem better than trying to have an alternative win condition, which just might not be enough to get there. Basically, the Augur of Bolas performs 2 functions. It allows you to more quickly assemble your combo, and it throws a blocker on the ground to stall your opponent. And if the Augur buys you an extra turn or two, that really is a lot. So Augur, as most of you probably already know, is just a blue and a colorless, a 2 mana 1/3 creature. When you play it, you get a trigger that says look at the top 3 cards of your library. You can grab an instant or sorcery and put it into your hand. So let's talk about the instants and sorceries, which there are many. There's Brainstorm, good old Brainstorm. And as many people have already talked about, Brainstorm, of course, interacts very well with fetch lands. The deck does run 2 Ash Barrens and 4 Evolving Wilds. You'll see slightly different variations of this depending on the particular deck list that you're looking at. Really quickly, we'll just check out another list. Here's a list that's only running 4 Evolving Wilds and 2 Terramorphic Expanse. This is probably more due to budget constraints than some sort of alternative superior deck building methodology. The Ash Barrens online are a little bit pricey. As you can see here, looking at online pricing, looks like the Ash Barrens are about a little over $5 a piece online. Here's another list running a couple. Let me just randomly grab one more list. So here's another list running 2 Ash Barrens and 4 Evolving Wilds. So I guess a lot of these lists seem to have settled on pretty similar 6 fetch lands across the board. Seems to be fairly uniform, but the exact composition of land doesn't vary a lot. But you could probably tinker with this if you wanted to. Throwing in, say, 3 Ash Barrens and 3 Evolving Wilds probably doesn't differ much as far as what's going on here. At any rate, Brainstorm allows you to draw 3 cards, throw a couple lands back on top of your deck, and then shuffle them away with one of your fetch lands. And then, of course, if you combine this with Gush, which the deck runs as a 4 of, you can pop off a Gush, throw a couple of islands in your hand, draw a few cards, brainstorm into some more cards, take the islands that you pick back up as the alternative casting cost on Gush, and then put those islands back on top of your deck with Brainstorm. allowing you to draw 2 cards from Gush, 3 cards from Brainstorm, and then you probably will draw some land after you've just picked up 5 cards from your deck. But even if somehow you didn't, you don't have to worry about shuffling anything good away because you just put the islands that you popped back from the Gush to shuffle away. Gush is one of the most important cards in the deck because it allows you to really just have the ability to kill your opponent very quickly, even if you're running light on cards in hand. So in a scenario where you're playing against the Tireless Tribe deck, or you're piloting the Tireless Tribe deck, and the Tribe deck is running really low on cards, the opponent of the Tribe deck might feel confident they're going to win because the only way the Tribe combo really works is if there's a critical mass of cards in hand to discard to the Tribe ability. Ideally, you want to have 5 cards that you can pitch for the Tribe ability so you can get over 20 damage in a single strike. Gush allows you to draw 2 cards and pick up 2 islands and do this all basically for free. You can tap the 2 islands, of course, before you bring them back to your hand. So you've spent 0 mana, you've drawn 2 cards, you've put 2 land from in play back in your hand, and you have 2 blue floating. So now there's 4 cards available to pitch to the Tireless Tribe. So as long as you had maybe another card or 2 in hand, you're in pretty good shape. You're ready to combo off. And this is the power of Gush in this deck, is it takes the deck from basically out of fuel and unable to combo to almost immediately being able to combo again, as long as there's at least another card or so in hand. Also, inside out cantrips, so it replaces itself, meaning in a scenario where the Tribe deck has exactly 5 cards in hand, including the inside out, that's perfectly fine because they can play the inside out on Tireless Tribe, and it'll cantrip itself, so everything still just works out fine. Daze is another card that you're going to see played with some variance between different deck lists depending on the particular deck that you're looking at, the particular composition. So let's just pull up a few lists again and talk about this. So here's a list that doesn't have any copies of Daze. Here's another list that does not have any copies of Daze, and here's another list that has a singleton Daze. So one of the things about running Daze in this particular list is that you already have the Gushes that you're going to be bouncing your islands with. So there's already a lot of pressure on balancing out how many islands you can afford to keep picking back up to your hand. The other thing is Daze, if you happen to have exactly, say, 3 islands in play on the turn you know you're going to combo out, then the Daze can be pretty nice because it gets you more cards in hand to pitch to your Tribe. You don't really care about having leftover lands in play as long as you're sure you're going to win that turn. And the other weird thing about this deck is you can actually, at least in theory, win on turn 2 by playing a Tribe on turn 1, hitting your land drops, and then playing inside out on turn 2. So having a Daze available, if you happen to be able to stick a Tireless Tribe on turns 1 or 2, having this little bit of extra tempo to deny your opponent is pretty good. But one of the reasons some lists don't even bother with this is because Circular Logic and Dispel are just really good and generally can perform the same function just about as well. One of the important things to point out on Circular Logic is that it has a Madness alternative casting cost. Circular Logic is a counterspell that says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard. And on the turn that you're comboing off, you're discarding a lot of cards into your graveyard. Its normal casting cost is blue and 2 colorless, but it's got a Madness 1 blue. The other nice thing about using Madness is when your opponent tries to do something to stop your Tireless Tribe from getting in there for a lot or critical damage, when you chunk the Circular Logic to the Tireless Tribe, you basically get to utilize a counterspell, do it for 1 mana, and you don't lose a card. It's not like if you just play the Circular Logic for its regular casting cost, then you're losing out on potentially 4 points of damage with the Tireless Tribe, which sometimes is fine as you're cycling through your deck and trying to fend off and hold off your opponent long enough to assemble your combo. But when it gets to the combo turn, you can just, when your opponent goes to do something, you just chunk the circular logic to the Tireless Tribe. You get to counterspell something for 1 mana, and you still get the +0/+4 trigger, which is pretty ridiculous. So circular logic is extremely good. The rest of the time, you're still generally, as long as you have a Tireless Tribe in play, it means you get access to a 1 mana counterspell, which is also really good. We've got Shadow Rift here, which says target creature gains shadow until end of turn. Now I'll be honest with you, one of the things that I don't fully comprehend about the Inside Out deck is I've seen a lot of these lists that are running Shadow Rift. Let's see. There's a newer card that does basically the same thing, only instead of giving your creature shadow, it just makes it plain unblockable. Which to me, I realize they're probably basically the same thing, but I would think that being able to be straight up unblockable would be better than shadow. I guess in a mirror match situation it gets kind of tricky, because if you're in the aggressive role, then you don't want to have shadow, because then your opponent can give their creature shadow and they can still block you. But if you're in the defensive role and you know your opponent's going to give their creature shadow, then you probably are going to like being able to also give your creature shadow so you can block. So there are some trade-offs there as far as the mirror match goes. But the rest of the time, generally what you want from this slot is you want to be able to ensure that your creature won't be blocked. And there's not a ton of shadow creatures floating around out there, so I guess this is mostly academic, but I feel like Slip Through Space is just a better option. It makes your creature completely unblockable, so there's no fringe cases where your opponent can have a random shadow creature or give their creature shadow and block. It just makes absolutely sure. Also, this gives you the cantrip. It's the same cost. This is its sorcery speed, but since this is the turn you're going to be going into combo off, it seems largely irrelevant as far as whether you're playing this at instant or sorcery speed. I mean, either you're going in for the combo or not. So I don't know. It just seems mostly, I guess one of the upsides to having the instant speed on the Shadow Rift is if you're just cycling through your deck and you're trying to make sure everything's lining out where you can actually hit a Tireless Tribe, or you're just digging for Inside Out, you might be able to do a better job of holding up counter magic and then playing Shadow Rift at the end of your opponent's turn, if you're just trying to maximize on the ability to cycle through Shadow Rift. And it may be that there's going to be more real situations where you're cycling Shadow Rift at the end of your opponent's turn, versus scenarios where having a sorcery speed card that makes absolutely sure your creature can't be blocked matters. I don't know, it's just something to look at and think about. Most everybody's using Shadow Rift. The original progenitors of the deck, who actually had given some thought to how this was being put together, went with Shadow Rift as well. So it's probably the superior choice, just because, again, there's not a ton of shadow creatures out there. But now that the deck is becoming more mainstream, it's certainly worth thinking about whether you want to be in a position to be able to block, or whether you want to be in a position to make sure you can jam your attack through and they can't give their own creature Shadow Rift to block you. I actually think it might make sense to have a mixture of the two, just so you can kind of have some options available. But I think the majority of people are just copying the deck list and running without really thinking about these nuances, which is fine. The deck is quite good. The original lists have been really good. There have been some really nice advancements made on the sideboarding, which I think makes a huge difference. Anyway, we'll move along. Preordain. There's a little bit of variance in the amount of preordains. Here's a list that runs 1 preordain. Here's another one with 1 preordain, 3 preordains. The only thing that really seems to be consistent is there's not a ton of lists out there rocking 4 preordains, which might be something that a lot of people would be surprised by, especially as good as preordain is. But a lot of the deck lists do seem to have a full playset of ponders, which is also interesting because you, you're not running any delvers. So with ponder, you're going to get to look at 3 cards, and if you need to, shuffle away and look at a 4th. With preordain, you could look at a maximum of 3 cards. So you play preordain, you look at your top 2, scry them both to the bottom, and draw a 3rd card. So ponder does theoretically give you access to looking at more cards, and so perhaps has more utility when you're trying to combo out. The brainstorms are mostly a 4 of, but you will see some lists that run less than that. So there's a couple of lists that just have a couple of brainstorms. I think when you're running fetch lands and you're running 4 gush, brainstorm is just so good that I would want to run it as a 4 of. A lot of these lists are running 3 dispels. That seems to be where things have settled at. Dispel just allows you to counterspell an instant speed spell, which, another funny thing, again, in the mirror match, normally operating off of a sorcery is a downside because you can't play it on your opponent's turn. But again, we're talking about the alternative to the Shadow Rift, the sorcery version that costs 1 mana, gives you the cantrip, but says unblockable instead of shadow. If you run that, it can't be counterspelled by dispel. And again, the only outside edge case where Shadow Rift would be better is when you're cycling through trying to find a combo piece or a Tireless Tribe and you're doing it on your opponent's turn. So I don't know, there's another little thing to think about in the mirror match where Dispel will only stop an opposing instant. Dizzy Spell is really nice because it allows you to get any 1 mana card that you need. More often than not, you're going to be utilizing the Transmute, but from time to time you can use Dizzy Spell as just a way to buy you an extra turn when you need to, by actually giving a creature -3, -0. And you do have a broad range of things that you can snag for 1 mana. Some of the more likely candidates are probably going to be something like Repeal or Gigadrouse. The nice thing about having the Singleton Dizzy Spell and the Singleton Gigadrouse is you don't have to worry about playing multiple copies of Gigadrouse, but you still have a reasonable chance of finding it, because by having Dizzy Spell you functionally have 2 copies of the Gigadrouse in your deck. And what's nice about the Gigadrouse is if you know your opponent's sitting on a boatload of instant speed removal and you're a little nervous about how that's going to work out, or if you know your opponent has a lot of, probably more likely a lot of counter spells, if they have a lot of removal, it's still going to be tough because you're going to have to stick your Tireless Tribe at some point, and then you might be able to force some interaction on their turn early with the Gigadrouse, but you're probably better off just to try to counterspell your way through the removal. So yeah, the Gigadrouse isn't going to help you, sorry about that, against removal, but it is going to help you against opposing counterspells. Whenever your opponent's sitting on a lot of counterspells, at the end of their turn you just Gigadrouse and tap down all their stuff, and they're pretty much dead in the water. Or if you know they have any other non-removal tricks, you just need to get them tapped down where they can't do any nonsense when you go in to kill them. You can of course also Dizzy Spell if you feel like you need to get a Dispel backup. You can get any of your cantrips, your Brainstorm. Maybe you want to get a Gitaxian Probe, you're set to go, but you want to know what's in their hand before you go off. And then there's Repeal in case there's some other problematic permanent on the board that you need to take care of. So there's a lot of different options as far as what you can actually get with the Dizzy Spell. Not to mention, once we get into sideboarding, being able to get a Piracy Charm can be important. Maybe your opponent has managed to stick a Flag Bear, so you have to actually stick Inside Out on the Flag Bear, which is a problem. So something like the Serrated Arrows or the Piracy Charm in the sideboard could be quite nice to clean up those kinds of issues. But we'll get to the sideboard more in a minute. Gataxian Probe is really nice because anytime you're playing combo, you want to know what kind of disruption your opponent has available. Sometimes you'll play Gataxian Probe, you'll know the coast is clear, and you can just end the game. Other times, you'll see what your opponent is sitting on and realize they have a lot of interaction to shut down your combo, and you can avoid walking into a trap. Take a little more time to hopefully set things up a little better if needed. The one over peel is just to deal with problematic things. For example, blue's not particularly well adjusted, this list especially in the main, with dealing with something like Circle of Protection white, for example. Now you could also get around a Circle of Protection white by utilizing Gigadrouse to tap down all of their land, but you'd have to make sure you've actually got enough lands to outrun their lands, because if they can keep even one open, they're going to be able to shut down your Tireless Tribe with a Circle of Protection white. Now there's not a ton of people out there running Circle of Protection white, so that's just a random example. There's probably more realistic problematic permanents that this deck has to worry about. There's the red enchantment that does 1 damage to you during your upkeep every single turn. But any problematic enchantment that's out there, repeal can deal with it, as well as just dealing with any other random thing you feel like you need to bounce. Maybe you're playing against Boggles, and by bouncing one of their enchantments when they declare attackers, you buy yourself an extra turn to get to a place where you can win. But all kinds of fringe scenarios where having a repeal is handy. And it cantrips, so you can always just bounce whatever random thing and then cantrip and continue to search for a Tireless Tribe or an Inside Out as you need to. We have already talked about Shadow Rift, Daze, Inside Out, Circular Logic. We've got our cantrips, and that's pretty much the deck. We already talked about Gush. We talked about the land. You're only going to have a few planes. I think basically all of these lists run 2 planes and about 10 islands. And then you've got, most of these lists seem to be running some combination of whatever type of 6 fetch lands. I would probably, if I was going to run this deck, and I'm not an expert, but I like the idea of running 3 Ash Barrens and 3 Evolving Wilds if I'm going to go with, the precise makeup of 6 fetch lands. I personally would probably maybe get a little greedier on the fetch land side of this and just go with 4, maybe even 4 Ash Barrens, 3 Evolving Wilds, and go down to 9 islands. I like having more fetch lands when I'm running the full playset of Brainstorms, because Brainstorm's just so powerful with fetch lands. But that's just me, I guess. Next up, we've got our last copy of Dispel on the sideboard, because having a 1 mana instant counterspell is really important. Most of the time when you get into counterspell wars, they're going to be on your opponent's turn, because you're going to drop your Tireless Tribe, you're going to go into attack, and they're going to try to interact with you on some way. One random thing to mention about the Tireless Tribe is, if they're trying to use Burn to stop your Tireless Tribe, you can just pitch random cards to keep it alive. And your opponent might think, oh great, now I'm emptying out their hand, but that's really just a trap again, because Gush can reload you. So Burn's just not going to be good against Tireless Tribe. The kind of things that Tireless Tribe has to watch out for are basically black removal spells, such as Chainer's Edict, various Edict effects, which is one of the reasons why we have Stormbound Geist in the sideboard. Stormbound Geist is also just good against the various fairies and delvers that are out there with the delver decks, so it's just a solid sideboard card all around. And Serrated Arrows is good against basically all the fairies and delver decks that are floating around. Very good there. It's good against opposing Tireless Tribe decks, because a -1/-1 counter on a Tireless Tribe is hard to deal with for the Tribe deck. And it's also good in terms of taking out flag bearers that might be causing problems and keeping the combo from going off. If there's a flag bearer in play, then it forces the Inside Out to target the flag bearer. So Spire Golem is, I think, primarily a tip of the hat to all these Delver decks that are floating around out there. Spire Golem is very good against the Delver decks, because Bolt won't kill it, which means blue-red Delver has to use a Scred on the Golem. And if you're able, you can fight back with dispels and whatnot, and you can just not even care about the bolts for the most part. If they attack you with a fairy and you block it, well then they could potentially bolt it, but you'd still get a 2-for-1. And if you've got a Dispel in hand, you're still getting a 2-for-1. So Spire Golem's just great, and then you have a lot of islands in your deck, so it's going to be a nice tempo value a lot of the time as well. This random copy of Deep Analysis, looks like that's showing up in several of the lists, is basically just there when you get into the grindier matchups. Deep Analysis is great as a 4-for-1, pay 4, draw 2 cards, pay 3 life, draw another 2 cards, so for 1 card you get 4 cards. That is about as good as it gets. Also, if you're in a situation where tempo matters, you can just chunk the Deep Analysis to the Tireless Tribe and draw 2 cards for 2 mana. You have to pay 3 life, but again, this is about as good as it gets. The Piracy Charm is just good against all the different random 1 toughness problematic creatures out there right now, like all the fairies, opposing Tireless Tribe decks. If you're going to do this though, you have to wait until after they play Inside Out. Then you play the Piracy Charm, because at that point, if they pitch additional cards to buff their toughness, Inside Out causes the pitched cards to go to power. So they will just die at that point. This is also why you'll see Gut Shot. Well, one of the reasons why you'll see Gut Shot in sideboards. Gut Shot is just do 1 damage to a creature or player for 1 red mana. It's Phyrexian mana, so you can pay 2 life instead. It's nice for killing off flag bearers, fairies, and Tireless Tribe. After they go with the Inside Out combo, the toughness will go to 1, the power will be huge, but that will be the opening to utilize burn spells to kill the Tireless Tribe. So, I guess the one thing I was thinking about earlier that I was trying to figure out how to articulate is the situation where Gigadrowse is actually good against removal is not black removal, it's red removal. So if you slam a Tireless Tribe against, say, a burn deck, and they start throwing pieces of burn at the Tireless Tribe, you can just pitch cards to keep the tribe alive. And then, let's say they're holding up mana open so that if you try to combo out and play your Inside Out on your Tireless Tribe, they can start launching multiple burn spells. And since the Inside Out is resolved, now your Tireless Tribe is just going to have 1 toughness for that turn, no matter what, I guess, unless you play another Inside Out. But anyway, by using the Gigadrowse to tap them down on their turn, it forces them to throw whatever burn they're going to throw at your Tireless Tribe before you've played Inside Out. So that way you can just pitch cards to keep your Tireless Tribe alive, and then once they're tapped out, you're safe to go ahead and execute your Inside Out combo plan, and ideally reload with Gush to get the win. And since they're tapped out now, you know for sure you should be in good shape. So yeah, basically Gigadrowse isn't going to do you much good against black removal, because they'll just play whatever they have once you go to tap their mana, and you have to spend so much mana to tap down their mana that you probably don't have counter spells left, and you're probably just going to lose your Tireless Tribe. But against burn specifically, Gigadrowse is actually an effective solution, because on your turn you can just keep pitching cards to any burn they throw at the Tireless Tribe, and then on their turn you tap them out and then you win the game. We've also got a few copies of Journey to Nowhere to deal with really large problematic creatures that we just have to deal with. Also, it's another option to take out a flag bear if need be. And yeah, that's basically it. Hydroblast is primarily a nod to being able to stop burn decks as well as just fast aggressive red decks. It's also not a bad card against Affinity, because a lot of their nastiest stuff, the Atog, the Fling, the Temur Battle Rage, these are all red cards that are going to blow you out. So yeah, a lot of where the sideboard is at has evolved to be very aggressive against Edict effects, control lists, and Delver lists. Inside Out combo is in a very good place right now. It is a top deck in the metagame for a reason. For a long time, and this is, I think, a great sort of teachable moment. For a long time, Inside Out wasn't even in the, I don't even think it was in the top 7 on the MTG Goldfish metagame rankings, but nothing has changed. It's just as good now as it was then. there's been no major there have been major shifts in the metagame, but there've been no major shifts in the metagame that I think have made Inside Out like vastly better than it was, say, 3 or 4 months ago. It's just that people have been tinkering with the sideboards and figuring out how to navigate things, and more people have been trying out the deck. The deck does look really weird, and creature combo decks have a reputation for being fairly fragile. There's a boatload of removal floating around, but more people have been figuring out how to pilot this. I think LSV streamed some with the deck, and that probably the Hall of Famer Louis Scott Vargas, uh, arguably one of the better Magic players of all time. I'm not saying necessarily the best, but one of the better players of all time, was streaming with the deck, and I think that certainly got the deck some attention. So, yeah, it's a it's a really good deck. It's a perfectly fine choice. As a random aside, I think that if people spent some time tuning the Tron lists out there, Tron could certainly battle back. I think Tron could have a very reasonable matchup against the Delver lists that are out there. Not quite as good against the Inside Out combo, but kind of okay. But I think Tron could certainly beat up on all these Delver lists that are floating around. You'll notice that, like for example, this list has a singleton serrated arrows. I think by getting a little more focused and having multiple copies of serrated arrows in the sideboard, that would make a rather large difference. Especially since serrated arrows is just backbreaking for these fairy decks, these Delver and Ninja decks and whatnot. And then when you combine the fact that you've got Ghostly Flicker shenanigans usually somewhere in the lists, if you've got a couple of copies of serrated arrows out just when your opponent thinks they've managed to outrun the serrated arrows, you Ghostly Flicker them. So I know there have been a lot of people complaining about the Delver and Tireless Tribe decks at the top of the metagame. And one of the things that you can do to push back is, I would say, tinker a little bit with the Tron lists. I don't know exactly what the right composition is. Tron hasn't been doing particularly well lately. I think in the most recent challenge there wasn't even a Tron list in the top 8. I think the highest ranked list was actually in 9th place. So here's the let's just pull up here's the let's see here. Well, let's see here. This is from 4/8. I think this is actually a week old, and I don't know. I don't think this Tron list actually won out. I think this is just showing what the rankings were at the end of the Swiss. But here's a 5-color Tron list that was actually leading the pack at the end of the Swiss. So that's a pretty good indication that Tron's actually not in a bad place. And again, I think the most recent challenge had a Tron deck at 9th. I do think Tron's being underplayed right now, and I do think that having extra copies of serrated arrows in the sideboard is going to be something that could really make a reasonable difference. Yeah, otherwise I think this is a pretty decent list right here. Oh, there, look at this. We've got a main deck copy of serrated arrows. So this right here is one of those little techie adjustments that probably catapulted Jasiri 84 to the top of that challenge. At least one of the adjustments. And Jasiri is a guy who's been playing Pauper for a long time. This guy goes way back. He's an old school Pauper player, so he definitely kind of gets it. But yeah, this is a pretty nice list that he's rocking here on a lot of different levels. I think this is a really good list. And if you're just really tired of feeling like you just cannot beat Delver decks, I would maybe give something like this a spin. Maybe drop. You could probably. Oh, let's see here. We got to drop something if we're going to throw. I would probably maybe drop an Ulamog's Crusher. It's good and it could blow some people out coming out of the sideboard. But I might consider dropping the Ulamog just to get another copy of Serrated Arrows. Just because you're going to be facing those Delver decks. And I think having having at least one more additional copy, having between the sideboard and the main, having 3 copies of arrows available is going to be pretty nice. You might even consider, dropping the Denrovahor, although it is a really nice option to be able to bring that in matchups where you know that the combo is going to work out well. All of these sideboard cards seem like very intelligent, really, really well, reasonably well thought out. You could maybe get away with dropping your Hydroblast, but this is a list that's only running 1 Pulse, so I can see why they want to have at least 1 Hydroblast in here against red decks. So yeah, maybe just you could get away with dropping your Ulamog's Crusher, throw another Serrated Arrows in here. So just a little addendum at the end of our review of Tireless Tribe combo for anybody that's looking for some way to push back against these tempo-y blue decks. Hey, use a Go Big blue deck. Anyway, that's all for today on the Pauper Metagame. Good luck in all your leagues and good luck in all your challenges. Peace.